Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in this video, I want to have a conversation about Magneto in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Because this is something that a lot of people are struggling with, how to put Magneto in the MCU. And it's kind of funny, because Marvel Comics already gave us a way to do it in the story of Secret Empire. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored by G.I. Joe War on Cobra. So whether you're a fan of the classic animated movies, the iconic toy line, the comics, or all of the above, G.I. Joe War on Cobra has something for everyone. It has a massive roster featuring the most beloved and infamous heroes, villains, and vehicles that have been featured over the course of the entire series. Once you've chosen your side in the game, you'll be introduced to the game's mechanics via Roadblock for G.I. Joes or Baroness for Cobra. Once this is done, you'll learn how to manage your base, your units, your vehicles, and engage in battles to help you get a feeling for managing your troops. And as you continue with the single-player campaign missions, more options for reinforcing your army with additional units, heroes, and vehicles begin to open up. But while you're here, I have a special in-game gift from D3Go. As a token of appreciation for checking out G.I. Joe War on Cobra, I'm giving away 2 free characters for all new players to help reinforce your army. And so, as the Joes would say, knowing is half the battle, check out the description down below to download G.I. Joe War on Cobra and receive your free gift for your mobile device. So, having said all of that, Magneto in the MCU. See, here's the thing. Whenever people talk about putting Magneto in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they always kind of seem to reference this idea that like his origin should be in line with what it was in the comics. And while that's nice and everything, the biggest problem you have with that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe follows more of a real-time concept, right? We've talked about that before. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is a blend between the Ultimate Universe and Earth 98, right? Where the Ultimate Universe is the world outside your window, right? Like, what if superheroes existed? Like, what if Marvel characters existed right now? What would that look like out there in the world? And then Earth 98 was an alternate reality in Marvel Comics where characters aged in real time. You know, eventually the Fantastic Four got too old to be superheroes. They were succeeded by new characters, same with Spider-Man and different things along those lines. Thor actually aged, all that kind of cool stuff. It was pretty cool. But the problem that you have with Magneto is if you were to say that Eric Lehnsherr was a kid during the events of World War II and then ultimately ended up surviving and then basically exists now in the modern age, at least in the aftermath of Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, then basically that would make him like 100 years old. And that's barely believable, right? Nobody's going to believe that a 100-year-old guy is running around controlling magnetism and just like whooping ass on like, you know, all these different characters that are out there, things like that. That's not going to work. That's kind of the benefit, but kind of the drawback of Magneto, right? Because his origin is super cool, right? If you guys ever get a chance, go check out Magneto Testament. It's one of the coolest origins, right? It was written by Greg Pak, and it gives us like this full-on origin story for Eric Lehnsherr going into when it is that he basically became Magneto, right? You go from there into like classic X-Men issue 12, I think it is, but it basically runs over the original origin by Chris Claremont of Magneto. It's cool, right? It's an interesting idea. But again, you can't really have a 100-year-old Magneto. Well, then people would counter with that and they would say, well, what about some kind of explanation where like mutants age slower than humans, right? Or like, you know, he was somehow frozen in ice or something like that, like Captain America. But the problem that you run into with that is it becomes hand-wavy. It's like, okay, so like we've got a character that we want to introduce into the MCU, but they would be really old at the time that they were introduced if we follow their actual Marvel Comics continuity. So we'll just say they're frozen in ice. It worked for Captain America and Magneto. It'll work here too, right? You know, where they just age really slow or something like that. And that can work for a couple characters, right? And, you know, really slow aging can work for like Wolverine, or it can work for Sabretooth, or it can work for anybody else who is part of the Weapon X project who has a healing factor, right? So like Deadpool, different people like that. But the fact remains, you can't use that all the time, right? And I think that's really a result of people who want to see Magneto in the MCU, but they don't want to see his character's origin change, and something's got to give, right? You can't have it both ways because it just doesn't work that way. And so, you know, in thinking about that, my idea was, how do we get him in there, right? Like, how do you put Magneto in the MCU? But then it started getting into like these, you know, real world situations and trying to tie all that stuff in. And it's like, but why though, right? Because we've got one built in with Sokovia. And the funny thing about it is that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Sokovia is largely unexplored. There really isn't a whole lot that we know about Sokovia. All we simply know is that like it's there and like that's where Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch came from. And that's it. However, we did get an explanation in the Captain America Steve Rogers Rogers stories from Nick Spencer that was part of Secret Empire. Now, here's the thing. Secret Empire was a story that a lot of people liked, but a lot of people disliked. It really kind of split, Captain America fans. I loved it. I thought it was an amazing story. Didn't really care for the ending too much. The ending was, I think, kind of planned at the last minute, but I love the story for what it was, right? The idea that Captain America has basically been part of Hydra this entire time. But in terms of getting an explanation on Sokovia, this came in Captain America Steve Rogers issue number 7. And what we ended up learning was that Sokovia was essentially part of the Eastern Bloc, right? And so the Eastern Bloc were basically countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact that was signed by the various members of the Soviet Union as an antithesis to NATO. And so the result of that is that when the Soviet Union fell, a lot of these countries that were previously part of the Soviet Union were just basically left without any real centralized government, right? Whatever kind of governors or stewards or what have you, who were basically running the show at that point in time, they were the ones that kind of kept running things, or sometimes there were no governments at all, right? It was just kind of like capitalism. Yay, we got rid of communism. Good luck, Eastern Bloc. You got this, buddy. That was basically it. That was the response to the United States for the most part, right? And so as a result of that, with Sokovia itself, at least in terms of this Captain America story, that what you ended up seeing was the rise of a guy by the name of Kamil Novody. He was basically a former Russian general or Soviet general who essentially took totalitarian control of Sokovia and started implementing all these insane human rights violations, and he was nicknamed the Butcher. Now, around this point in time, what ended up happening is Hydra stepped in, and Hydra stepped in as kind of like, hey guys, we're here as liberators, when in reality they weren't. They were kind of manipulating things, but essentially they kind of took over. They ended up seeing him ousted. Red Skull ended up, taking over Sokovia, so on and so forth, and that was basically it. But the significance of this, and the reason why it matters, is because if the Marvel Cinematic Universe were to take that notion of Sokovia from Marvel Comics and then modify it a bit and throw it into the MCU, and then in turn give us Magneto, it works perfect. It works absolutely perfect. And all you have to do is just say that Magneto was like a younger boy when essentially the Eastern Bloc fell, and Sokovia, like so many other countries, was just kind of left flying by the seat of their pants. And so he ended up witnessing firsthand these atrocities of Kamil Novody, right? Like ended up seeing these things going down, and then in turn realized how screwed up humanity could be. Along the way, you can throw in some things like there were individuals with powers that started popping up, and then you really kind of turn this into essentially the Winter Guard, and you just transform it into what was going on in Sokovia, right? So the way this played out in terms of the Winter Guard, to offer some explanation here, in Marvel Comics, the Winter Guard was essentially Russia's answer to the Avengers. But the reason why this mattered is because at the time when the Avengers first popped up, Russia didn't really know how to deal with it. And so what Russia ended up doing was basically sending various soldiers around the country and then rounding up everyone who had superpowers, and then they were essentially going to force them to fight on behalf of the Soviet government. What this did is it basically led to the attempted roundup of guys like Colossus. Colossus was ultimately rescued by Charles Xavier and then brought to the States to fight alongside really the third iteration of the X-Men. Deadly Genesis really kind of introduced the second team that we didn't know about, the secret X-Men team that nobody knew about, like Vulcan, this Omega level mutant, and so on and so forth. But the fact remains that the Winter Guard ended up forming out of Russia's response to the Avengers in the midst of the Cold War. And so that's what you basically do here. You say that what Kamil Novody had basically discovered is that there were individuals in his country that had powers. What the origins of those powers were, he didn't know, he didn't care. All he knew was that they had abilities and they could be used to bolster the power of his army, because maybe he wanted to rise to prominence and have a place on the world stage like so many petty dictators are looking for. And so as a result of that, he ended up rounding up various individuals with superpowers. Well, in turn, Magneto, Eric Lenscher, at a young age, saw this and saw the experiments that were being conducted, so on and so forth. And that goes into the whole idea of when humanity comes across individuals with powers, either they're destroyed or they're exploited. And it totally warps and skews his perspective on humanity. And then of course you end up having the events of Avengers showing up. They're not doing Sokovia any favors, and it's kind of like enough is enough, right? So what you basically do is you say he was there in Sokovia from the time that the Eastern Bloc fell all the way up until the events of Avengers Age of Ultron, and watched as everything unfolded, and slowly began to lose faith in humanity and began to come to the realization that mutants, being what they are, would either be captured by humanity and used for their own ends, or destroyed if humanity couldn't find a means to contain and control them. And so in turn, he ends up becoming more of like a mutant extremist, right? He's not really a good guy, not really a bad guy. He's just a guy who believes that mutants deserve their own place in the world, and he'll force humanity to give them that by any means necessary, right? So I think it's a cool notion. Right now, again, this is napkin stuff, right? This is me thinking of something in the span of like 15 minutes, right? So this is off the cuff, probably deserves a little more planning and a little more looking into in terms of organizing this. But I think just, for some napkin math, essentially, I think it works, right? I think it kind of comes together pretty well. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know how you guys feel about this, and let me know if there's changes you guys would make to this whole idea, right? Because I love your all's input. I love hearing what you guys have to say about this kind of stuff. So if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.